1950s era Windsor, Detroit mystery photo. I came across a vintage black and white Windsor, Detroit photo taken from a very interesting vantage point. The photo, unfortunately, is undated, so it's going to be up to us to try and figure out when it was taken and what was going on in the photo. The location is right along the Detroit River, here, the old Canadian Pacific Railway cut. You can see the tracks and above a sliver of the bridge that runs over the tracks. This photo is interesting to me for a variety of reasons. The history of the location itself, as well as some of the things that are going on inside the photo. An easy way to date any old photo is by the cars. I sent a copy of the photo to some friends who know a ton about cars, and they got back to me with some pretty insightful observations. The problem with dating photos based on the ages of cars in the photo is that you can only get a close estimate, the newest car in the photo. But it will give us a better idea of when the photo was taken, and it will just be another tool in the dating process. My car friends seem confident that this car here is a 1955 Dodge Regent Coupe. Here's a side-by-side comparison. What do you think? The Windsor Police motorcycle is interesting. This is a Harley-Davidson police Servy car. The Windsor Police used these vehicles for several years, and at one time the force had quite a few of them in service. I have seen a few photos of these trikes in the SWOTA archives, and they date back to the 50s. Looking past the cars for a second to the stone wall of the bridge overpass. This is the last remaining remnant of an amazing structure that once stood at that location. That original brick wall was still there in the 1950s, and miraculously, the wall is still there today as of 2023. That is the Canadian Pacific Railway Station, which stood at that location from 1890 until sometime in the 1930s. I've always loved this one-of-a-kind structure and always keep an eye out for old photos of it. Sadly, there are only a handful of photos of the structure in existence. The station was victim to the creation of the Michigan Central Railway Tunnel. Passengers no longer had to take the train ferry across the Detroit River. They could now conveniently go under the river in the Michigan Central Railway Tunnel, which opened for passenger service in July of 1910. The train tunnel is still in operation today but does not accommodate passenger cars. But that may soon change. There's obviously a special event happening. That is why there are two cameras set up along the river. You can see the cables from the cameras running through the photograph as well. They actually took the time to dig a little trench and snake them under the Canadian Pacific Railway tracks and run them all the way back to the CKLW building for the broadcast. I'm curious to know if this structure was built specifically for the event, or was it always down there? Behind the two cars, we can see a large boat sitting in the river. This boat looks very familiar to me. I see it pop up from time to time in other old photos and films. Most notably in this film taken during Queen Elizabeth's visit to Windsor in 1959. I always suspected that this boat belonged to the RCMP, based on what this man is wearing in the film. It's the ceremonial Mountie Red Surge. After doing some digging, I was able to confirm my hunch, and was even able to identify the name of the Windsor-based RCMP patrol boat. It's the Chilkoot II. And then I came across some footage of the Chilkoot II sister ships, the Cutknife II and the Shaunavon II, being tested out in this film reel from the late 1940s. So whatever it was happening on the Detroit River that day, the Mounties were there. So was this photo taken during the Queen's 1959 royal visit? No, it was not. Look at the boat docked on the Detroit side of the river. You can make out the name of the ship. It says Eastern States. That is a huge clue and puts this photo years before 1959 and the Queen's royal visit, to 1956 at the very latest. And if you look very closely, there is another, much larger ship behind the Eastern States. That white vessel is called the SS Greater Detroit. These boats are a huge clue in dating the photograph because both ships were scrapped in 1956. On December 12, 1956, the Eastern States and the Greater Detroit were towed out to Lake St. Clair and set afire, burning away their decorative plaster and wooden superstructures in order to make it easier for the wreckers to get at her metal for scrap. An interesting side note is that the massive anchor from the Greater Detroit was cut off and simply dropped to the bottom of the Detroit River. The anchor was forgotten and sat on the river bottom for over 60 years. However, in 2005, it was rediscovered and then finally retrieved in 2016. The anchor of the SS Greater Detroit now sits on display outside the Port of Detroit. This location also happens to be connected to a series of murders that occurred between 1945 and 1946. The serial killer was dubbed the Windsor Slasher, and he terrorized Windsor's waterfront parks for 2 summers. The body of one of the slasher's victims was found just steps away from the Canadian Pacific tracks, and was discovered by a Canadian Pacific employee. A true crime novel about the slasher killings was written by Windsor author and lawyer Patrick Brode. The book's title, The Slasher Killings, A Canadian Sex Crime Panic, 1945-1946. It is a very well-written and researched book that delves deep into the killings and the trials that followed. The slasher taunted police with a series of letters and was eventually caught and convicted of murder. Ronald Sears, aka the Slasher, is said to be responsible for the deaths of 2 men and the attempted murders of 3 others. Each of the stabbings occurred near the Detroit River. Okay, switching gears now, remember how the land where the photo was taken was close to the old Canadian Pacific train station? Well, right behind that location was the Canadian Salt Company. The Canadian Salt Company, also known as Windsor Salt, was founded in 1893 by 3 employees of the Canadian Pacific Railway. The story goes that the company sunk a test well on the CPR's land in Windsor and found salt in 1891. I wonder if that's where the name Salter Avenue came from. Notice the kids sitting on top of the Canadian Pacific train? It was a different time. The police were right there and seemed to be okay with it. I'm not sure if these photos are from the same event, but it sure looks like it. The Walkerville Collegiate Band is playing, and here an American naval helicopter from the 50s era is hovering over the river. It's hard to tell for sure, but it looks like there's somebody floating in the river. Like a speedboat is passing through, sending up wake. And you can see a man with a film camera in the bottom of the frame. Here it looks like there's a small speedboat floating in the river, and it looks like they're working on the engine. The engine compartment is up. There is a long history of boat races on the Detroit River, but the course has always been on the American side, Belle Isle. To back up the idea that that's a speedboat with engine trouble, take a look at the work truck. It has the name D. Shell written on the door. I checked that name in the Windsor City Directory from 1955 and found this: Shell Delbert, Mechanic, Underwood Limited, 332 Edward Avenue, Riverside. So there was a mechanic there that day, and it's possible that he was there to help fix the issues with the boat motor. In recent years, the cut entrance was home to this memorable sculpture, the UFO. I managed to photograph it a few times over the years. The UFO was eventually removed and scrapped after it started to fall victim to the elements. I was coincidentally there the day they removed it. In summary, I'm guessing that this photo was shot in the summer of 1955 or 1956, shortly before the eastern states and the greater Detroit were burnt in Lake St. Clair. Just to make sure, I wanted to find out how long the eastern states and the greater Detroit sat unused along the river. I found this photo from 1954 showing the 2 ships, so it looks like they were on the river for a few years. Thanks so much for watching, and I'd like to give away a copy of Patrick Brode's book, The Slasher Killings. All you have to do is subscribe to my YouTube channel, Michael Evans, Windsor, Ontario. Special thanks to the car guys and gals. The train tracks under the bridge are now long gone, and that area under the bridge is now vacant. I learned a lot making this video, and I hope to do many more like this in the near future.